Have you ever been talking to someone and suddenly felt a chill run down your spine, even though the other person was smiling brightly? There was no insulting word. There was no obvious suspicious behavior, but there was something invisible but extremely frightening that made you wary. An inexplicable feeling, as if something was secretly wrong right in front of you. It wasn't your rational mind speaking up. It was a more ancient reflex, a part of you that recognized danger before you understood why. It's often dismissed as imagination, oversensitivity, or overthinking. But in fact, it might be the only signal you get before you're caught up in a very subtle form of psychological danger. Carl Jung called this phenomenon an instinctive warning of a particular type of person. A type of danger that doesn't manifest itself in violent behavior or bad words. It hides behind a mask of perfection, in charm, in a smile that is too perfect. And because it is so subtle, it slips through all the usual defenses. Only your instincts remain, whispering that something is wrong. Picture this. You are talking to someone who is very intelligent, very attractive, who seems to understand you immediately. They listen attentively, respond with the perfect words, and make you feel as if you have known them for a long time. But then, for a very small moment, there is something in their eyes, in the way they look at you, in the emptiness behind their smile, that makes you pause. Something is not right. That is the first signal. A chill that goes down your spine, not from temperature, but from a disorder in your nervous system. Not because they are doing anything wrong, but because they are not really present. They are present, but you do not feel the real life from them. It's like talking to a clone who's programmed to react correctly. Jung once said that there are people who live with a deep inner split. They have hidden their shadow side so well that they don't even know it exists. But it's alive, it's still active, it's still finding its way into other people. When they look at you, they don't see you. They see the part of themselves that they've rejected. And then they start reacting not to you, but to their reflection in you. The feeling you get when you're around this type of person is a warning, a whisper from the deepest part of your psyche. It tells you that you're facing an invisible kind of danger, psychological invasion that begins with seduction and ends with you doubting yourself. The scary thing is, these people usually don't mean to hurt you. They don't know what they're doing. They believe that their feelings, their judgments, their actions are correct. And because they believe so, they are so convincing. Not just to you, but to anyone who will listen. An invisible but pervasive danger. Why should you pay attention to that chill? Because it is a sign that you are entering a strange energy zone. A space where empathy is manipulated, where you can become a character in someone else's psychological script. And the scariest thing of all, you won't know it until it's too late. We are taught to be polite, to believe in the good in others, to give people a chance. But survival instinct doesn't work that way. It works by noticing subtle things that the rational mind misses. Like a sound that doesn't sound right, but still messes with your brain. A look that doesn't have any emotion. A silence that lasts too long. A touch that makes you pull away without knowing why. Remember, what makes you feel insecure doesn't have to be obvious. Sometimes the scariest thing is what no one else sees. People who make you feel unsafe don't do anything specifically wrong. They just don't fit reality. They're not wrong, but they're not real either. That's why that chill is so important. It's an indicator that you're dealing with a type of person who can hurt you, not with a fist, but by twisting your perception and dragging you into a world where the truth is no longer clear. And when that happens, there's only one way to protect yourself. Back away. Disconnect. Trust your gut. Because when your instincts warn you, it means something in the other person is no longer human. It's a shadow in human form. And that shadow is looking for a new home in you. Next, we'll explore what's really behind this phenomenon. Where does that darkness come from? And why does it seek to latch onto the most vulnerable people? Don't look away, because understanding this could be the thing that saves you from some of the deepest psychological damage humans can inflict on each other. There is nothing more strange than feeling misunderstood by someone who has no reason to misunderstand you. You say something normal, but their response is aggressive, defensive, or aggressive. You feel as if you have been accused of something you don't even understand. In that moment, you may feel stunned, confused, even doubtful. But what is happening is not you. It is an ancient psychological mechanism that Carl Jung called projective identification. Imagine you are standing in front of a strange mirror, but instead of reflecting back your true self, it is projecting back everything the other person fears, hates, and refuses to see within themselves. That mirror is you, and what you are receiving is not an objective view, but a systematic distortion of the other person's unreconciled inner self. It's when you become the stage for inner dramas you never signed up for. Carl Jung described the shadow as the collection of parts of yourself that you can't or won't accept. Repressed emotions, unacknowledged desires, hidden memories. But the shadow doesn't go away. It doesn't stay quiet. When it's not acknowledged and reconciled, it begins to find its way into other people. And that's when it shines on you. People who are unaware of their shadow have a very good time seeing negative traits in others. They say you're selfish, when they themselves are behaving as if the world revolves around them. They call you a liar when they live in a bunch of polished versions of the truth. They claim you're aggressive when you're simply expressing your boundaries. And the thing is, they believe it. There's no pretense. They actually see in you what they cannot see in themselves. Jung warned that this is one of the most dangerous psychological mechanisms because it makes people lose the ability to reflect. When a person begins to live in a state of constant projection, they enter a world where everything negative is external, never internal. And that makes them immune to change, healing, or true growth. They live in a reality censored by the fear of facing themselves. What makes this mechanism even more dangerous is its persuasiveness. When the projectionist talks about you to others, they talk with almost absolute certainty. That certainty makes others believe that they must be right. Even though you are the one involved, you are easily doubted. Why? Because you do not speak with the same intensity as they do. You are confused, they are very clear. And in modern society, certainty is equated with truth. You might think that this only happens to people with mental disorders, but it doesn't. It's a common mechanism in all of us. Everyone has a shadow. Everyone projects. The question is not whether or not, but how much and how often. Mentally mature people know when they are projecting, and they find a way to stop. Immature people indulge in it without knowing it, and they are the ones who can cause the most damage. The clearest sign that you are being projected is that you feel strange to the other person. They describe you in terms that are completely inappropriate. They attribute motives to you that you don't have. They are convinced that you think something that you never thought. And when you try to explain, they don't listen. They don't respond to the real you, but to the image of you they have built up inside themselves. Worse, when you are projected for a long time, you may start to doubt yourself. You wonder if you're being selfish, if you're being too sensitive, if you're being a jerk. This is reverse gaslighting. You're not being manipulated by intentional words, but by the other person's genuine but misguided beliefs. And it's more dangerous because it's not easy to spot. Shadow projectors can be charming, even attractive. They are often smart, able to connect, and make you feel special at first. But over time, you will begin to feel drained, lost, and disoriented in the relationship. That's because you are living in their image, not your true self. So how do you protect yourself? The first thing is to learn to trust your own feelings. When you feel like you're not being seen properly, when what you say is being distorted, when you're constantly being blamed for things that don't make sense, stop. Don't try to prove yourself to someone who isn't willing to see you for who you are. Don't stay around to fix your image in their minds. You can't win a battle with a shadow that they don't see. Next, learn to recognize your own shadow. Every time you see someone who makes you extremely uncomfortable, ask yourself, is that a part of yourself that you are also avoiding? You can't stop others from projecting shadows onto you, but you can stop yourself from being the one who continues that cycle. You may not be able to control how they see you, but you can control how you hold the truth inside you. We live in a world where darkness is not always an obvious evil. It is often sweet, loving, and close. But when it is projected, it turns the closest relationships into battlefields. And you will only keep your integrity if you are conscious enough to know you are not the reflection in someone else's distorted mirror. Next, we will look directly at a more subtle layer of danger, when the shadow is no longer just projected, but is hidden behind a mask so perfect that no one, not even the person, knows what is real and what is fake. That's when you're faced with someone who's living entirely in a false identity. And that's when you really have to be on your guard. There are people who always know what they are doing. They speak at the right time, smile at the right place, react just right, as if they were programmed to never do anything wrong. They give off a feeling of comfort, politeness, and gentleness that you cannot find a single point to criticize. But then, there is a small, very small moment when you feel something is not real. A soulless look, a reaction lacking depth, a feeling that you are not really connecting with the person behind the smile. The feeling is not clear, but persistent. And if you are awake enough, you will realize that you are facing one of the most subtle and dangerous psychological phenomena that Carl Jung ever described. Complete identification with the persona, the social mask. Persona, according to Jung, is the psychological shell that each person develops to adapt to the world around them. It is the part we show to the outside world to be accepted, loved, appreciated by society. In essence, persona is not bad. It is necessary for us to communicate, to work, and to exist in a community. The problem arises when people no longer distinguish between the mask and the real self. When they believe that the persona is themselves, a person who has completely identified with the persona is someone who no longer has any internal conflict, because they have repressed everything that does not fit the ideal image they have created. There is no more contradiction, but also no more humanity. There is no more truth, only role-playing. And that creates a kind of presence that is extremely smooth, but at the same time extremely cold. You feel that fakeness not because they do bad things. It is because they no longer do anything that comes from within. They react in a stereotyped way, say the right things, live like a copy designed to never create conflict. But that very perfection is a sign of something extremely wrong, the absence of the true self. Fernando Pessoa once wrote, "The problem is not the mask. The problem is when you forget you are wearing it." When people forget that they are acting, they not only deceive others, but they also lose themselves. They lose their sense of real emotions, their true needs, and gradually lose the ability to connect deeply with anyone, including themselves. This does not happen overnight. It is the result of years of contorting themselves to fit in, to please, to avoid being hurt. Every time they hide a true feeling, they build another layer of mask. Every time they say what society wants to hear instead of what they think, the mask gets thicker. Until, one day, there is no one left inside to step out of. People who live completely in persona are admired. They are role models. They always seem to be okay. No anger, no jealousy, no envy. But it is not because they have overcome these emotions, but because they have repressed them to the point of not being able to recognize them. And what Jung discovered is that the repressed part does not disappear. It accumulates, it morphs, it returns like a giant shadow, and often in the form of sudden destructive behavior. Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's close student, pointed out that the people who keep the most perfect masks are often the ones who have inexplicable outbursts. They can live a year of gentleness and patience, but then one day they break everything over a small detail. That is when the shadow explodes, because it cannot be contained any longer. You can recognize a persona that is too perfect by the way it reacts to contradiction. A real person will be confused, angry, or even embarrassed when confronted. But people with deep personas do not react spontaneously. They have a scripted response. They say the right things, they sound nice, but the emotions don't match. You don't see a real presence, you see control. This is where your nervous system comes into play. Your body starts to react, even though your mind can't quite figure it out. Your heart rate increases slightly. You feel cautious. You don't trust them, even though you have no real reason to doubt them. It's real. Because your nervous system, especially your mirror neurons, can detect a mismatch between their true feelings and their outward appearance. When someone is wearing a perfect mask, the micro-signals, the eyes, the tone of voice, the body language are out of sync, and you feel it, like a wrongly tuned instrument. The problem isn't just the inauthenticity, it's the danger. The more perfect the persona, the more intense the shadow behind it. People who live entirely in personas can't face the truth about themselves, and that makes them highly capable of causing harm, not out of malice, but because they are disconnected from their true humanity. They will not listen to criticism, because any criticism threatens the mask. They will not tolerate deep intimacy, because intimacy requires the removal of defenses. They will react violently to the truth, not because they hate the truth, but because they have invested their entire identity in keeping the mask intact. The important question is, what should you do when faced with someone like this? First, do not try to break their mask. That never works. They will get defensive, attack, or retreat. Instead, you need to hold on to your reality. Do not get caught up in their script. Do not try to please them or fix them. Stand firm in your feelings, hold your boundaries, and if necessary, walk away. And if you find yourself in any of these descriptions, know that no one is asking you to be perfect. In fact, it is the cracks that allow the light to come in. Start by recognizing what you are doing to fit in and what you are forgetting. A mask only becomes dangerous when you forget that it is a mask. Next, we will delve into an even more terrifying phenomenon. When it is not just a mask or a projection, but when a person is completely taken over by a psychic force beyond the individual, the power of ancient archetypes, then you are no longer dealing with a person, but with a living symbol. And the consequences can be unpredictable. You are talking to someone, and suddenly something strange happens. Nothing physically changes. The face, the voice, the gestures are the same, but you feel as if you are standing in the presence of a completely different person. Their gaze is deep and cold, a light that is not the person you once knew. There is no more animation, no more personal presence. There is only a sense that they are being controlled by something far away, more ancient and not their own. Carl Jung called this phenomenon archetypal possession. One of the most profound manifestations is when the individual self is swallowed up by ancient psychological patterns deep in the collective unconscious. In this state, people no longer act as individuals, but as embodiments of a symbolic force. Savior, justice warrior, eternal victim, or ultimate punisher. Archetypes are fundamental structures of the human psyche, dating back to the earliest days of human history. They are living symbols that shape how we feel, behave, and react to the world. Each archetype carries within it a value system, a story, a purpose, but also a hidden darkness. And when a person becomes completely identified with an archetype, they lose the flexibility of their individual psyche. They no longer have free will. They act on the dictates of a script they are not even aware of. The ancient shamans spoke of the phenomenon of spirit possession, when an entity beyond the individual self enters the practitioner. They made a clear distinction between the state of actively accessing the spirit world in controlled rituals and the state of unconscious possession, where the individual is no longer in control. Jung did not use the word possession in a supernatural sense. He spoke of it as a psychological fact. When you are not strong enough to dialogue with your inner self, the shadow or archetype takes over. The most obvious sign of archetypal possession is the rigidity of perception. The possessed person no longer doubts himself. He does not say, "I think so." He says, "That is the truth." He does not feel. He proclaims. He does not argue. he preaches. In their eyes, everything becomes dualistic. Right or wrong, light or dark, good or bad. There are no gray areas. And they are always on the right side, the bright side, the good side. They believe this not out of arrogance, but because they can no longer distinguish between themselves and the symbols they represent. They can be the father who says everything he does is for the family, but controls every breath his children take. They can be the activist who always stands for what is right, but attacks anyone who disagrees. They can be the healer, but at the same time see themselves as the only channel of the ultimate light. They do not know that they have become the instrument of a part of their psyche that they do not own. Jung saw this in political, religious, and spiritual movements. When a leader begins to believe that he is the embodiment of the collective will, there is a great danger that he has been swallowed up by an archetype. And because the archetype has such a powerful symbolic power, it can exert a tremendous influence on the group. The possessed person radiates an almost mesmerizing energy, the magnetism of absolute certainty. And that is the most dangerous thing. Absolute certainty makes others stop questioning. It creates an aura of the light of truth, making everyone around them feel small, doubtful, and withdrawn from the active position of the psyche. They begin to believe because the other person speaks with the voice of a higher reality. And once this happens, the community loses its critical capacity. A possessed individual leads a group of people who voluntarily abandon their ego and the moral consequences to join the collective symbol. The hallmark of this state is the absence of humanity. When you come face to face with the possessed person, you feel that they are no longer there. You cannot connect with the soft, vulnerable, complex part of the human being. Instead, there is a living symbol, the savior, the perfect victim, the moral warrior, or the cold punisher. They may be very intelligent, very eloquent, but you cannot find any softness, real empathy, or ambiguity in their voice. There is only a terrifying clarity. Modern neuroscientists have noted this at the biological level. When a person falls into a state of identification with the archetype, the brain regions involved in personal awareness, self-reflection, and emotional regulation may be inhibited. Meanwhile, the regions involved in transpersonal experience are highly active. They truly feel that they are on a mission larger than themselves. But larger than oneself is not always a good thing. Every archetype has two sides, light and dark. The savior can become a vigilante in the name of justice. The good person can become a victim who never takes responsibility for himself. The warrior for what is right can attack everyone in the name of good. The darkness of the archetype is more dangerous than the darkness of the individual, because it is collective and justified by grandiose meaning. The important question is, what do we do when we recognize this in others or in ourselves? First, learn to recognize when you are starting to speak in the voice of a symbol instead of a person. When you start to feel like you are the only one who is right, the only one who sees clearly, the only one who is chosen, that is when you need to stop and ask yourself, where am I speaking from? Who is speaking within me? Second, when confronted with the possessed person, do not try to argue with logic. They are not in a logical space. They are living in a symbol. They don't need the truth. They need a world that fits their role. And if you don't play the role, they will write you off. What you need to do is hold your boundaries, hold your feelings, and retreat if necessary. Not because you are weak, but because you cannot fight an archetype with conventional reasoning. Ultimately, Jung said that the way out of possession is not to deny the archetype, but to learn to dialogue with it. Know that it is there. Know that you can be drawn into the role, and thereby keep enough distance so that you don't lose yourself. Because the soul is not a warrior or a saint, the soul is a space that can hold all the roles while still retaining the true self. In the next section, we will encounter a phenomenon of even deeper tragedy, when people are trapped in painful loops created by their own unconscious. It is no longer a temporary role, but a whole scenario that is replayed over and over again, a haunting repetition. And that is the true sign of a soul crying out for help. There are people who always end up in the same tragedy. No matter how different the beginning, they change jobs, change living environments, end a toxic relationship to start a new one that seems good. But then, everything goes back to the starting point. They are betrayed again, abandoned again, fall into the role of victim again. And each time they are surprised, hurt as if it had never happened before. Jung called this phenomenon the compulsion to repeat, the unconscious obsession to repeat, a kind of destiny that people create for themselves but are never conscious of. What makes this phenomenon dangerous is not the repetition, but the unconsciousness. People caught in this loop do not know they are repeating. They do not deliberately choose suffering. They do not deliberately seek failure. They believe that everything is changing, that this time will be different. But deep down, they are still controlled by psychological patterns that have never been processed. Christopher Bollers, a contemporary psychoanalyst, once called these patterns unthought knowns. They are early experiences, too early or too painful to be consciously processed, but imprinted in the nervous system and psyche as unwritten rules. And from these unconscious rules, an individual will unconsciously organize his or her life to reproduce what is familiar even when it hurts. A person who was abandoned by their parents may unconsciously choose a cold partner, then push them away, and then suffer from abandonment. A person who grew up in a controlled environment may repeatedly create conflict with anyone in authority. They think they are fighting the past, but in reality, they are reenacting it in the unconscious hope that this time it will end differently. Jung called this a form of psychological karma, not in a religious sense, but in the sense that an unexplained pattern will continue to replay itself until it is recognized. Until the unconscious becomes conscious, it will run your life, and you will call it fate. The danger of this phenomenon is that it tends to draw others into the role. Donald Kalshed, a Jungian analyst, pointed out that people with a painful repetition pattern often have the ability to lure others into their unconscious scenarios. They are not deliberately manipulative. They are simply living out a scenario that they believe to be reality. And those around them, if they are not conscious enough, will be drawn into the role: the abandoner, the betrayer, the ununderstander, the punisher. And then the cycle continues. This scenario often comes with a very specific narrative style. People stuck in the compulsion to repeat tell stories as if fate is against them. They use phrases like, "Here we go again. Why is it always the same? I just want to be loved, but I always get hurt." They tell stories as if they have no role in it, and that is what makes it impossible for them to escape. Because to break a cycle, the prerequisite is to recognize that you are repeating it. Modern neuroscience has confirmed that early traumatic experiences leave an imprint on neural structures. The brain, which operates on predictability, will choose to repeat familiar patterns, even when they are harmful. This creates a phenomenon called confirmation bias, the tendency to only accept information that matches existing beliefs. When a person believes that they are always betrayed, they will ignore signs of loyalty and only see behaviors that can be interpreted as betrayal, even when there is no clear evidence. What makes the compulsion to repeat a fated trap is that it is both painful and familiar. And humans, paradoxically, tend to choose the familiar over the good but unfamiliar. We choose known pain over unproven hope, and that is why the cycle continues. The only way out is to do what the unconscious fears most. Face yourself. Recognize the pattern. Question the repeated choices. Ask yourself, why do I find this person attractive? Why do I react so strongly to this type of behavior? Why do I always see myself as a victim? These questions are not easy to answer. They lead you into your own darkness. But only when you go there can you break the unconscious connection between the present and the past. Jung did not promise that this process would be quick or easy. He only said that it was necessary. Because otherwise, you are not living your life. You are reliving an old story. A tragedy without an ending, written by memories you do not remember. In the final section, we will no longer talk about danger, but about the possibility of transformation. Because the shadow carries not only danger, it also carries unreleased creative energy. When you dare to face your inner darkness, you do not just escape fate. You begin to rewrite it. You are no longer the victim of the old script, but the author of a new story. And that is true freedom. There is a common misconception that psychological growth is about becoming perfect, erasing mistakes, washing away the ugly parts of yourself. But Carl Jung offers a different, deeper, and more courageous approach. He does not say that we must become good in the sociological sense. He says, "I would rather be whole than good." This is not an excuse for the darkness, but an invitation to look it in the face with courage. Because only when we accept ourselves as a whole, both light and dark, do we have a chance to truly heal and grow. Reconciling with the shadow is a journey, not a moment. It begins with acknowledging that we have a shadow, parts of our personality, emotions, memories, motivations that we have rejected out of fear, out of shame, out of not wanting to lose the love of others. The shadow is not something evil or hateful. It is the parts of ourselves that have been pushed into the shadows because they do not fit the image we want to project. As children, we learn to survive by adapting. If crying causes others to abandon us, we learn to laugh. If anger causes us to be punished, we learn to be good. If daring to express ourselves is seen as selfish, we learn to sacrifice. But those emotions do not disappear. They are simply repressed. And over time, they become the shadow, operating unconsciously, influencing our behavior in ways we do not realize. The first step to reconciliation is observing without judgment. When you feel angry, instead of trying to suppress it, ask yourself, what am I protecting? When you feel jealous, don't blame yourself for being a bad person. Take it as information. What is it that you crave but are afraid to face? When you feel like controlling someone, instead of feeling ashamed, ask yourself, what insecurities are making me feel unsafe? Reconciliation doesn't mean acting on every emotion. It doesn't mean accepting harmful behavior. It simply means daring to recognize the parts of yourself that you have hidden. Like a mother listening to her child crying in the dark, not chasing it away, not giving in to it, but sitting beside it, so that it knows it is not abandoned. The miracle is that when darkness is acknowledged, it loses its power to destroy. What we deny will come back to hurt us, but what is seen with compassion will gradually dissolve and transform. It's like stirring up murky water, which starts out murky, but gradually clears as we lose our fear of it. Modern psychology calls this process integration. As the fragmented parts of our minds come together, we become less reactive and more selective. Daniel Siegel, the renowned neuroscientist, calls this the whole brain state, when the brain's raw emotional parts are connected to the brain's logical parts, responding with coordination rather than conflict. People who experience psychological integration can feel things deeply, but without being consumed. They can feel anger without acting destructively. They can experience sadness without sinking into despair. They know what they are feeling without identifying with it. People who have reconciled with their shadow do not need to prove themselves. They do not struggle to be accepted. They can admit mistakes without falling apart. They can listen to feedback without seeing it as a threat, because they are no longer afraid to face their imperfections. They do not need masks, because they are no longer ashamed to see themselves. There is one clear sign of a person in the process of reconciliation. They speak the truth without bitterness. They can talk about their past with clarity, not to seek pity, but to understand themselves. They can talk about mistakes without blaming others. They live with their inner conflicts without having to resolve them all. They are not perfect, but they are real. From a spiritual perspective, many traditions have described this process with profound symbols. In Tibetan Buddhism, there is the concept of turning poison into medicine. That is, negative emotions, if recognized and worked with properly, can become enlightening energy. In Western alchemy, a field that Jung loved so much, the process of psychological transformation is described as turning lead into gold. From the discarded parts, we can create a new, stronger, deeper self. Jung once said, "Where there is the greatest darkness, there is the greatest potential for light." This does not mean that we have to seek pain in order to grow, but it does mean that what we have run away from can become a source of strength if we have the courage to turn and face it. And when that happens, a subtle but profound shift occurs. We no longer look at others with judgment or hatred, because we understand that there are parts of ourselves that are being rejected, that are seeking to be heard. Instead of reacting, we can reflect. Instead of confronting, we can connect. And it is that non-judgmental presence that is the most powerful healing. There is a kind of power that does not need to shout. It is the power of someone who has walked through the darkness and is no longer controlled by it. Such a person does not need to prove anything, because their very presence is proof of the truth. They do not say, "I am the light." They just stand there, with the darkness embraced, and radiate a peace that cannot be faked. Coming to terms with the darkness is not a destination. It is a practice, repeated every day. A choice not to turn away from the parts that are not perfect. An act of courage to love ourselves without reason. And from there, we can truly love others. Not everyone is ready to take this path. But if you have read this far, perhaps a part of you has spoken. A part that wants to stop playing the game of escape and start the journey back to yourself. Not to become better, but to be yourself, fully. And that is the beginning of true freedom.